Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 68, part 2, in which we'll examine Richard III, the 1955 Laurence Olivier version. My name is Martin Darlington, and this week I am absolutely delighted to join us for the second half of this two-part show Derek Birks, who is the writer, the creator and the host of the Wars of the Roses podcasts. Can be found on iTunes. We'll have a link in the show notes to the podcast. And also as you heard earlier, an excellent historical author. Derek, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Martin. I'm delighted to be here to take part. My background is obviously not just Wars of the Roses, but that's been my focus for probably a decade now at least. And I'm very happy to bring any expertise I have today.
Yeah, the whole thing that's become apparent, I've listened to your show pretty much from the outset. I think you were about 4 or 5 episodes in when I found you, and I think the first interaction we had was I wrote and said, "There's any chance you could make your episodes longer?" Because you do these great little snippets, which now anyone discovering it, they can binge listen, and it's great. And unlike us, you don't do these very long-winded intros, so you just, but it makes you realise it. We do love to pigeonhole things, and we try and categorise it. We say, yeah, it started then and it finished then, and what your show makes really clear is actually it was just a long, continual process, which eventually did have an end, but it's really, there's not actually that many years where big things happened, and it's like a few things happened concentrated, and then nothing would really happen for a while, and really complicated to follow. It's
a long story. You've got to see it as a long story, but the motivation for me in starting the podcast, because I've done 46 now and there'll be 50 in total. But when I started, my motivation really was to try and counter some of the myths that fly about on this particular topic. It's a somewhat emotive topic in the 21st century.
Yeah, and it still is. I served in the army with a very good friend who was from Yorkshire. He was from Barnsley, and he told me that his grandfather had gone down to the market and bought some rose seeds to grow some roses, and they were white roses, obviously, and then one came up red, and he had to be restrained by other stallholders as he marched down to the stall, and he was trying to whip the stallholder with this red rose because it made him so furious. And it's incredible that it still goes on when you consider that the name York and the name Lancaster were given to royal children as, oh, you can have that title, you can have that. Okay, that might be where they made their seat, but it's it's not like these guys were born and bred in Lancashire and in Yorkshire. So it's incredible how powerful that rivalry still remains. And I believe the Wars of the Roses title itself didn't even appear till much later.
No, that's right. I think, as you said a few minutes ago, it's about episodes. It comes in episodes. And sometimes there's a particular crisis. There's about 3 or 4 crises in the whole period. And at that point, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah.
But the rest of the time, life goes on as it always does, really. And the problem with the period for many people now is that they see it as a complete period. Now, if you're living through it, of course, you don't see it that way at all. And so what I tried to do in the podcast was to limit my horizons and say, right, I don't know all the I haven't got all the hindsight. What I know is what is happening then.
Yeah.
And, so that was the way I approached it.
I think in many ways as well, maybe the success of Henry VII was, how many generations with the average age as it was then would have lived under this continual, well, who's the king now? Oh, it's this bloke. wasn't he the king before? Yeah, he was, but then this other bloke was, and now he's... And it makes you think of the success of Augustus and how the Roman Empire came in with, there would have been the children growing up under Augustus their grandparents would have told them about endless civil wars. Their parents would have seen the ends of them where, then this army will march through, then that one will. So when he dies and people now will look back and go, yeah, it's a shame they didn't reinstate the Republic. You think, why? The last 150 years of the Republic was nothing but civil wars, or the last 100 years at least. And yet he brought them stability. Why would you go back to that? So, it's so difficult to see it through the eyes of the people there. But we should get on with the show, and so I'm afraid people are just going to hear me, having heard me all last week on my own, apart from the odd clip. Oh, by the way, for everyone, we're not going to do clips from this movie, and the reason is Olivier speaks in that very British stage, sort of, mid-20th century style, and it's Shakespearean language, and it doesn't really translate to audio very well. When I started reading Shakespeare, it took me a while to dial into the language before I was sort of stumbling, thinking, thou doth hast what now? So there won't actually be clips, but thankfully my voice will be broken up with our expert in Derek, who will be coming in for the reality check. So first of all, the story of the movie, released in 1955, late 1955 in the UK and in spring 1956 in the US. It was shot mainly in studios. Olivier himself wrote the screenplay adaptation, directed the movie, and starred in the title role as Richard III. The exception to the studio shooting was the Battle of Bosworth, which was shot in Spain, which was an area Olivier decided was just green enough to pass for Leicestershire. He had wanted to shoot at the original battle site, but it was cultivated as fields with roads running across the area, so it was unsuitable. No one seems to notice that there are mountains in the background of the battle scenes, which kind of make it clear that it's not rural Leicestershire, but that seems to have been passed off. One interesting note, during the climactic scene of the battle, the horse that Olivier was riding was padded up to receive an arrow from a master archer. But as the archer fired, Olivier moved his leg forward, and the archer shot him in the left calf. Showing typical dedication to his craft, Olivier continued filming, saying, "It's all right, it's my left leg that's injured, and as that's the leg I've had Richard limping on, there's no need to reshoot." And then later he sought some medical aid, so props to him for that. His wife, Vivien Leigh, did want the part of Anne Neville, but Olivier gave the part to Claire Bloom instead, despite being married to Vivien Leigh, and he then went on to have an affair with Claire Bloom during the filming, so maybe you can question his motives for the casting decision. In the US, the movie was released simultaneously on television for an afternoon showing and at cinemas. Possibly partly due to this decision, it was a box office failure, having cost an estimated $6 million to make, yet only recouping some $2.8 million worldwide. Having said that, it was very well received on NBC television, who'd paid $500,000 for the screening rights, with their audience estimated at 62 million according to Criterion Channel, a service that look at these things. The movie was re-released in the US in 1966, and we've read that it broke some cities' box office records, but we've been unable to find what money it recouped at the box office. Those figures don't seem available. It was nominated for one Academy Award for Olivier as Best Actor, but he lost out to Yul Brynner for The King and I, although he did win a BAFTA for the award for the role in the UK, and it did win BAFTA's Best Film Award. Rotten Tomatoes rates it at 83% from critics and 79% from audiences. So, anything to add to the movie background itself, Derek? I mean, I assume you've seen it, and I was just wondering, before we launch into the detail, if you have like a one-sentence synopsis of how it left you feeling.
Well, yes, for me, I must admit the Olivier voice, skillful though it is, was a bit of a turn off. So I didn't see the person I see as Richard III in that role at all. But as a film, I thought it was quite good. I mean, it's of its time, of course.
Yeah, and I think before we launch into it, it is worth saying that this is a movie based on a play written by William Shakespeare towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign, and he's writing about the man who was the reigning king when challenged by her grandfather, Henry Tudor, who went on to become Henry VII. Spoiler alert, Richard's going to lose. So we have to look at that in context, and this is very much part of this. You've mentioned it. David Crowther in his History of England series has mentioned it. It's been mentioned by a number of the people who really focus on this era, that the Tudors were master propagandists, and they really did, if not rewrite history, they certainly wrote it with a certain spin that really took hold. And of course, we spoke at the beginning about Shakespeare, in the introduction, about Shakespeare's sources, and one of those, indirectly possibly, would have been Sir Thomas More, writing under Henry VIII. So, one generation closer to this battle, about Henry VIII's father's protagonist. So Sir Thomas More definitely didn't like Richard III, and seems to have been one of the main reasons that he's been set upon this path of the evil king.
Yeah, I mean, I think the phrase Tudor propaganda, we need to be really careful with, because for me, propaganda is a deliberate attempt to mislead. Deliberate and persistent attempt to mislead. That's the definition of it.
True.
So when we talk about chroniclers like Edward Hall, who was one of Shakespeare's main sources, then he's writing for the time. He's writing what he thinks people generally believe.
Yeah.
So he's not making up something that then they've never heard of. He's not trying to sway somebody's opinion. He's not trying to convince anybody at the time. He's putting a spin on it, yes, because it's Edward Hall that really comes up with this whole the unification of the houses of York and Lancaster by the Tudors. So he puts that really on the table. And obviously for someone like Shakespeare, that's a big dramatic sort of theme. But what we mustn't forget is that he's writing Richard III 100 years after Bosworth, or later than that. And for Queen Elizabeth, who's the queen at the time, it's not something she's going to be that bothered about. She's not bothered about the fact that it was her grandfather or great-grandfather. And as I've said many times online, she was far more concerned about his Richard II, which seemed to throw into question the whole idea of monarchy and what made a monarch, and could you change monarchs? Because the last thing Elizabeth wanted people to hear about was how you could depose a monarch.
Yeah. Oh,
so,
right. So it's more the principle rather than the individuals involved.
Yes, I think people of the time, when Shakespeare wrote a play, he didn't write it for propagandist reasons. That's my point.
Sure.
Now, he certainly made an absolute dog's dinner of Richard III. I mean, as a person, the Richard III he created is a fictitious character.
Yeah.
Like King Lear or Hamlet or any of his other tragic heroes. And where we go wrong today sometimes is in trying to blame Shakespeare somehow for misleading us. He wrote it a long time ago. He wasn't setting out to mislead anybody, really.
Yeah. When you put it like that, maybe we shouldn't be so hard on Mel Gibson with Braveheart and The Patriot. But
yeah.
And of course, and Shakespeare was the entertainer. He's not there to deliver a history. Although I suspect an awful lot of people who may not have known about events before would have seen it and thought, okay, I know what happens in that now.
Absolutely. And that is true today. We don't learn history at school. We learn history from what we see around us on TV and films and books. That's where we get it from.
Yeah.
And it sticks, it sticks.
Yeah, and so many people, when if you say William Wallace, they picture Mel Gibson with a mullet and blue paint and a kilt, all of which are incorrect. Well, I don't know about the mullet, but the paint and the kilt are incorrect. But yeah, so I think entertainment has a power and therefore also a responsibility. But as this series has proved, this is episode 68, and there's very few that we've thought, that absolutely hits the mark. Some get the spirit correct. Anyway, before I go into another long diatribe about that, we should get on. So the synopsis of the movie. The opening credits tells us that the story of England, like many other lands, is an interwoven pattern of history and legends. And this story comes at the end of a long period of strife called the Wars of the Roses. So it's almost saying, look, don't take this as fact. There then follows a list of the principal characters. We are told King Edward IV is played by Cedric Hardwicke, Richard of Gloucester by Laurence Olivier, George Duke of Clarence by John Gielgud, both of whom are younger brothers to the king, and then Henry Earl of Richmond, who would later become Henry VII of the House of Tudor, is played by Stanley Baker, who we last saw in Zulu. The opening scene sees the crowning of Edward IV, Richard's elder brother. He looks quite an unimposing figure in his late middle age and dotes on his young son, who is also called Edward. The royal procession passes through cheering crowds as we gain the idea that these are popular rulers. Left alone by the empty throne, Richard, with a crooked back, limps towards the camera, and immediately breaking the fourth wall, he tells us that this is the winter of our discontent, despite the end of the recent wars. He bemoans his unsightly looks, resents his royal brother's sport with ladies, and this is a clearly embittered man who appears to be aware that in war he has value and purpose, but at peace he has nothing in which to deploy his talents. He quite openly covets the throne, but admits there are too many lives between him and the crown. Despite his crooked back, he reveals he is to marry the Lady Anne, played by Claire Bloom, who he widowed by killing her former husband, Edward, Prince of Wales, in battle at Tewkesbury. Anne is in mourning for her dead husband, and we see her crying by his coffin. Richard appears and orders the monks to put down the coffin, even striking down a man-at-arms who tries to intervene. Anne is furious and clearly despises Richard. She prevails, and the monks pick up the coffin again and leave. Richard, again addressing the audience directly, breaking the fourth wall, he says that he will marry Anne despite having killed her husband and, he adds in almost an afterthought, her father, but he will not keep her long. He then ponders on the fact that Clarence and Edward still live and keep him from the throne. We see Richard whisper to his brother, King Edward, but we do not know what he said. But the next thing, the king demands Clarence to be sent for. Richard again turns to us and says, I am plotting and I'm starting my brothers against each other. I've told Edward that there's a prophecy that G of the royal line will murder Edward's children. Glancing through a window at the court below, Richard sees Edward order Clarence arrested and taken away to the Tower of London. Richard intercepts his brother and shows shock when he learns that Clarence has been taken to the Tower. He blames the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, and promises to work for his brother's acquittal. Talking again to us, Richard seems almost proud of his duplicity. So the opening scene, sets us straight up to the fact that here's a Machiavellian character and he actually mentions Machiavelli at one point, although Machiavelli was 14 when Edward IV died, so I don't think Richard III could have read his book yet. I don't think he'd written it at that age. He'd have been very precocious if he had. So Derek, set us up. How much of that is nonsense? I'm going to guess a lot of it.
Well, I think that what you've got to remember is that youth is the key here. That in fact, Edward IV, his two brothers, were all very young when Edward became king. Edward was barely 19. He'd already won two great battles before that.
Yeah.
So he was a prodigy in military terms and politically. No one ever expected that the person that young would become king, and he brought with him these two brothers. So you've got a dynasty there almost immediately, but they're young, and I think that's the main thing about the film, and obviously Shakespeare's play, is that it contracts the timeline of the events. So instead of things happening some distance apart, they appear to happen one after the other, which creates dramatic tension, obviously, but in terms of historic accuracy, it distorts what happened.
Sure.
So, you've got young Richard, who at the time that Edward became king was only 9. So all the things that are being attributed to him in Shakespeare's play and in the film are clearly cannot be the case at that time. So that's one thing. But if you look at the relationship with Anne, which is clearly flagged up at the start of the film and the play as being a really big issue, they did actually know each other, probably because Richard spent some time in the Earl of Warwick's household in the 1460s, but they wouldn't have known each other in 1461. So when Richard was a little bit older, he was in Anne Neville's household, and he would certainly have known Anne. Some historical novelists like to sort of portray them as childhood sweethearts who eventually then get married. But I don't think there's any real substance to that.
I mean, is it true that certainly at this level of European aristocracy, we put far too much stock in our current society where you marry for affection, and whereas at that level, marriages were almost entirely for alliances, to join families together and for the acquisition of power?
Well, I think Anne Neville is a classic example of that.
Yeah.
Her first marriage to the Lancastrian prince Edward was entirely not only a political marriage, but it was an entirely shocking and unexpected political marriage, because it meant that the Earl of Warwick, her father, who had been a stout Yorkist, was basically doing a deal with his arch enemy, the Lancastrian queen, and therefore that marriage was a business deal, if you like. It was a quid pro quo. And so her first marriage was political, and also her second marriage, though also political, her marriage to Richard, was really in both their interests, because Anne Neville was one of the greatest heiresses in the country. She and her sister Isabel were the only heir. The two daughters of Warwick were his heirs. There were no sons. And so the whole of Warwick's he had enormous estates. It said that he owned land from one end of the country to the other. You could walk from the south coast to the north and not step off Warwick's lands.
Wow.
So a vast inheritance.
Yeah.
And it was split between them. Now, Isabel was married to Richard's elder brother, George, Duke of Clarence. And it was in Clarence's interest to get the whole thing, the whole inheritance. And along comes Richard and says, well, actually, Anne Neville, that'd be a good bride, because she brings with her immense inheritance in terms of lands and wealth. So you've then got, in fact, a standoff between the brothers, which their elder brother, the king, Edward IV, is trying to decide what he can do about it. It's a mess, really, but it's in Anne's interest to marry Richard, and Richard's to marry Anne.
Sure. And as we spoke about at the beginning of the Henry V episode, his father, Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke as he was originally, was a cousin of King Richard II. Here we have a similar sort of thing, in the sense that both of these usurping kings, Henry IV and now Edward IV, are descendants, I believe, of John of Gaunt, who was the third or fourth son of Edward III, who really messed things up by living so long.
Well, Edward IV and the Yorkist line was descended from a different son.
Right.
He was not descended from John of Gaunt was the Duke of Lancaster, so the Lancastrian name is the one that it passes through to Henry VI.
Right. Yeah.
And the Edward IV and his father, Richard, Duke of York, are descended from a slightly younger son.
Was this Lionel? Was it Lionel?
Well, we're into the most complicated aspect of the Wars of the Roses. Basically, to try and put it in a nutshell, if you're Edward IV, you've actually got two links back to Edward III. You're descended through a female line to Lionel, who was an elder son of Edward III to John of Gaunt. So if you like, you've got a better claim than the Lancastrians. But on the other hand, you're descended through the male line to a younger son than John of Gaunt of Edward III. So, he's got two claims, but they're dodgy. You could argue both ways, and everybody did. But the other thing to bear in mind, just briefly on that, is that until 1461, when Edward became king, nobody was really talking about the dynastic issues at all.
Right.
It wasn't an issue. They weren't fighting about that.
Got you.
Okay?
Yeah, I mean, and we know that Henry VI was largely ineffectual. So we've already talked about Elizabeth and the fact that Shakespeare was writing during this reign, and I feel comfortably corrected in that, because I'd sort of had an idea, well, Shakespeare couldn't be rude because she'd have chopped his head off, but actually I'm definitely over-egging that. The bit about Anne Neville's husband dying in battle, is there any suggestion that this was at the hands of the Duke of Gloucester, as Richard of Gloucester? But because I'm thinking, hang on, he'd have been too young to have fought in that battle, I'd have thought.
The other thing to bear in mind is that, again, we start the film in allegedly 1461. Her husband wasn't killed till 1471. So this is 10 years later, by
Right.
which time Richard is about 18 or 19. But we don't actually know who killed Prince Edward, her husband. We know that he fought at the Battle of Tewkesbury. We know that he was in retreat. We know that the Duke of Clarence and the Duke of Gloucester were both in the area, as it were. They were both pursuing
Yeah.
the Lancastrians. But there's no direct evidence that either of the brothers killed Prince Edward. They may have done.
Sure.
If they did, to be honest, it's probably more likely that Clarence did. But I mean, we don't know, basically.
Yeah, and the bit in the play where about this prophecy that G will murder Edward's children, the princes Edward and Richard. I mean, G could be George, Duke of Clarence, or it could also be Richard, Duke of Gloucester, which starts with a G. I mean, is that completely made up? There's nothing. Is there anything about a prophecy? Because I know that, however much we might scoff at such things, people then would take it that sort of thing quite seriously.
Yeah, I don't think I've never heard that there was a prophecy of any sort, and also I think people in the 15th century would probably not have been influenced that much by it. It's funny, but it's an age where, I mean, for example, Elizabeth Woodville was charged with witchcraft at one point, by largely because Warwick wanted to sort of blacken her name a bit, but it all came to nothing. It's not as if the 15th century is a time of immense superstition.
And of course, we've got the Renaissance going on in Italy, particularly. So I suppose science is rearing its head, or it's trying to reassert itself. So
Yeah, yeah.
So back to the movie, we see Anne by her husband's tomb, and she has this scene with Richard where he's trying to woo her, but it's very dramatic, and we don't really need to go into detail because it's almost certainly fictitious. Then we hear that Brother Edward is ill. Queen Elizabeth, this is Elizabeth Woodville, she's worried and asks a courtier what will become of her if the king dies, as Richard is likely to become protector, and she is aware he is not a friend of hers. Whilst we're here, in this scene, King Edward gives Richard a warrant for Clarence's execution. So eldest brother gives youngest brother a warrant for the middle brother's execution. He's clearly unwell and shuffles away as Richard leaves the tower. Clarence is in the tower telling a visiting friend, whose name's Brackenbury, that he had a dream about being on a ship, and then he's pushed overboard by his brother Richard, and he bewails the fate that's landed him in the tower. And then Gloucester arrives, meets the Dukes of Buckingham or the Duke of Buckingham and Catesby, and they tell him that the king has revoked Clarence's order of execution. But then Richard, through some shenanigans, manages to get rid of them, and a lady enters the scene. This is Jane Shaw, who was King Edward's mistress, and Richard jokes with Brackenbury about her presence, saying that she must have worked on Edward to secure the release of Lord Hastings, who has also been in a cell, and we see him released. Hastings is told that the king is ill and he appears worried, and when they arrive back at court, Richard is confronted by Queen Elizabeth, and he accuses her of favouring her friends to the damage of him and his brother, and then some courtiers mutter that Richard covets the crown, but then are told to be quiet by Lord Stanley, who appears to be a peacemaker. So, to sum up, we've got Clarence has been thrown into the tower. We've got this chap Hastings, we haven't met yet. He's just been released from a cell, and we've seen that clearly the Queen and the Duke of Gloucester, Richard, are court enemies. Again, he's getting ahead of himself, isn't he?
It's difficult to know where to start with all that lot, really, because the problem again is the timeline. Because again, he wants to create a sequence of dramatic events. They are both sort of out of order and also contracted. The issue of Clarence, perhaps we should deal with first. Clarence was executed in 1478, so about 5 years, 5 or 6 years after Richard married Anne Neville.
Yeah.
Now, during the 70s, Richard's focus is very much in the north. In fact, Richard's focus is in the north of England from about 1475 onwards, and perhaps even earlier. But basically, he's not around most of the time.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about any interaction between Clarence and Richard, not that they'd be the best of friends anyway, but it's not happening because they're not together. Clarence is very much based in the south, Richard very much in the north. But why is Clarence executed? Clarence is executed because he's a fool, basically. He's never satisfied with what Edward gives him. Edward, throughout his reign, is a very obliging king, as long as you don't make the mistake of crossing him more than once. So he forgives you, but there is a limit.
Yeah.
And Clarence, he gives more rope than anybody else. Clarence just goes for it all the time.
Yeah, it's incredible that the amount of second chances he's given.
Yeah.
And then as soon as he sees a sniff of getting something again, and I think, thank goodness for the people of that time that he was never successful. And to the point that the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker at one point, he even sides up with him, isn't he? And
yeah,
that saw the end. Because in this play, Warwick seems to have already be gone.
Yeah, because, I mean, obviously Warwick is killed at Barnet in 1471, which is in the middle, actually, of the whole thing in a way. I mean, the play starts a lot earlier than that. But he's inconvenient from a dramatic point of view.
Yeah.
His story, if you like, is a different story, and it's sort of half over during the film. So I think Shakespeare seems to sort of cut him out and concentrate on the younger ones who will get to the end of the story, as it were, in 1485.
Sure. Yeah. And Hastings, Lord Hastings, now, was he ever put in prison during Edward IV's life? Because I thought Hastings was like his absolute go-to guy.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Hastings was a friend. He was not just loyal, but they had he had supported Edward in the difficult times. In fact, he always supported Edward, whatever, whether it be a difficult time or not. Now, he became very powerful through his favour with Edward. But when we get to when he was arrested, this is much later. This is 1483, by which time, Edward is dead. So, yes, if you regard Hastings as being the most loyal courtier a king could have, then that's him.
I mean, I read one article that said he was Marcus Agrippa to Edward IV's Augustus, but Augustus wasn't particularly, good at military matters, so he had Marcus Agrippa to do it for him. He said, in this case, you need to think more of if Marcus Agrippa had been the sidekick to Julius Caesar. That's far more what it's like. Because Edward IV was an incredible warrior, wasn't he? I mean, I don't know how true it is when they say he was 6'3". That would have made him an absolute giant amongst the average.
You have to ask yourself, how is it that a youth of 18, which he was when he fought his first battle at Mortimer's Cross, how was it that he was able to win against seasoned commanders? And the same later on at the Battle of Towton and so on. How was it that men followed him in battle? How was it that they fought so hard for him? And it's quite simple, really. If you're on the field, anywhere on the battlefield, you're going to be able to see Edward IV. Yes, he was taller than average, but also he'd be wearing fantastic armour, probably made in northern Italy, and he'd be wielding 2 pole axes. And he'd be bashing the life out of enormous number of people. So if you're on the field of battle behind Edward, you're saying, I'm with that guy.
Yeah.
Because, he was very difficult to beat.
Because the alternative is I might have to fight him. Yeah.
Yeah, he was an impressive warrior, no doubt about it.
I mean, it's similarly to the Caesar comparison. I've read some very gentle criticisms of him that he was too forgiving. He was too merciful, and there were some people who, like you say, eventually his patience would run out. But definitely in the case of Clarence, he seems to have been really trying to avoid a situation where he had no choice until the point he got to where he felt he had no choice.
I think with Edward, you can't win in a way. If you're lenient with your enemies, you can be viewed as weak. And if you're ruthless with them, you can be viewed as harsh. So I happen to think that Edward got it pretty much right. He learnt that you needed to be careful. I mean,
Yeah.
he was very forgiving with a number of key enemies, not least Warwick, for example, and Clarence. I mean, he gave these people, very powerful men, he gave them second, third chances. He tried all the time to have a consensus of the nobles with him, because any king to survive needed that consensus of the nobles.
Yeah.
Democracy wasn't around really. We were talking really about the support of the key magnates in the country. And it was worth, he thought, taking a bit of a risk if he could keep them on side. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. So back to the movie. Catesby arrives, telling them all that the king has called for the Queen and his brother. Richard tells everyone else to go ahead, shuffles off, and then he speaks to two executionists and gives them the original warrant ordering Clarence's execution, and warns them not to be moved by his brother's sweet speech. They wake Clarence up, he sees their purpose and cries out, but they knock him out and then drown him in a vat of wine that was curiously left standing in a corner of a dungeon. King Edward is in bed, and whilst not strong, he doesn't quite seem like a dying man, despite his prediction he'll be called to his Redeemer imminently. He orders Lords Rivers and Hastings to reconcile with each other. Several other court hatreds are reconciled, although the oaths of friendships appear quite insincere, only really said to please the ailing king. Richard of Gloucester arrives and humbly greets his brother and king. The Queen asks for Clarence to be brought so she can share in the general reconciliation, but at this point Richard says, "Oh, sorry, he's dead." The king says he revoked the order, but Richard says, sadly, the first message had been acted upon before the second arrived. At this point, Edward leaps from the bed, raves about the injustice, then he nearly collapses and he has to be helped back into bed. And hearing the Queen cry out, we learn that the king has died. Urged by a courtier to summon her son, Prince Edward, the Queen recovers her senses and the Duke of Buckingham agrees to fetch the prince. So, again, all these timelines, like you say, they've been compressed into a very compressed thing that's been extra squashed.
Yeah.
Richard was up north, wasn't he? And I think most of the people seeing this scene weren't actually there.
That's right. I mean, it's tangled as well as compressed. I mean, Clarence was long dead. He died 5 years earlier in 1478. So what we're witnessing here, this scene allegedly should be in 1483, the key year when the big crisis occurs because Edward IV dies younger than it was expected that he would die. But he still
Yeah.
has two sons. But no, Richard is in the north. He does not see his brother before he dies. Rivers is in Ludlow with the young prince because he's the governor of the young Prince Edward, Edward's eldest son. So the Queen is there, Hastings is there, but those two key people, Earl Rivers and the Duke of Gloucester, Richard of Gloucester, aren't in London at the time.
No. And I mean, King Edward was, what, 40, 41 when he died?
Yeah, around about that, yeah.
Do we know what he died of? Because it does become apparent that he was a bit of a glutton.
Yes, he was. There was no question about that. And you could argue that he went to seed a bit in his middle age and was overweight and all the rest of it. The argument about how he died, the jury's still out. The most likely thing is that he got some sort of a chill and deteriorated from there because he was not ill for that long. Now the suggestion has been made that he was poisoned. The usual culprit there is Elizabeth Woodville, his queen. But when you think about it, here is a queen whose power depends really on her husband. Why on earth would she poison him?
Yeah.
It beggars belief, really. So I think my own view is that he died of natural causes. maybe his body a bit weakened by the fact that he was, as you say, a glutton, and he was driven to excess in food and drink quite often. So maybe not the healthiest individual as such. But yeah, probably natural causes, I would have thought.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, yeah, if Prince Edward had been 20 and looking very capable, you could sort of look at Elizabeth Woodville a bit, maybe more with as a potential suspect, because, you know, if her son had sort of said, look, you helped me become king early, I'll look after your mum. But yeah, it does seem very unlikely. Back to the movie. Richard is standing by the bed of his dead brother, and he's encouraged by one of his allies to get between the Queen and the Prince. We see it snowing as the Queen and her younger son Richard, this is young Prince Richard, await the arrival of Edward, the heir to the throne. But a messenger arrives to tell the Queen her brothers, Lords Rivers and Grey, have been made prisoners by the Dukes of Gloucester and Buckingham, but the messenger doesn't know why and what charge. The King's mother is with them and mourns her lot. She's lost her husband in an attempt on the crown. She's lost 2 sons and senses that the remaining son, Richard, is plotting. So the Queen takes her son, Richard of York, to sanctuary in a church with Westminster Abbey, as we see Prince Edward, accompanied by Richard of Gloucester and his men, riding towards London. Entering the city, Prince Edward is surprised that his mother hasn't come to greet him, but a messenger arrives to tell him that the Queen and the younger son have taken sanctuary. Buckingham tells Lord Hastings to go to the Archbishop and fetch Prince Richard, if necessary, plucking him from his mother's jealous arms. Richard and Buckingham then escort the young Prince Edward into the courtroom, where he sits on the throne as the 2 men conspire quietly in the corner in a very pantomime villain kind of way. Richard tells his nephew he'll be safe in his new home in the Tower of London. Edward says he doesn't like the Tower, although he does know the London one was built by Julius Caesar. As the Prince explores the court, Richard and Buckingham again talk about the gossip that the Prince might be illegitimate. As they talk, the younger Prince arrives. This is young Richard, and the 2 boys greet each other before young Richard delightedly greets his Uncle Richard, a clear favourite of the lad. Told they're going to the Tower, young Richard says he's told it's haunted by the ghost of their Uncle Clarence, who was murdered there. And they leave as Buckingham asks Richard of Gloucester what they should do if Lord Hastings refuses to agree with their plots. Why, chop off his head, is the reply. So, snowing is the first thing.
Yeah, unlikely. It's late April. It's possible, I suppose, but it's not very likely. The whole thing about what Richard of Gloucester does and the princes and all the rest of it, it is a complex story, but it's made more complex by jumping to conclusions in the 21st century, I think. The issue is this. Richard is in the north, as we've said. He gets news of his brother's death. And he also gets a letter from Lord Hastings. Hastings is not an enemy of the Queen as such, nor is Richard of Gloucester. But quite clearly, in this regency period, somebody is going to take the reins. And obviously, if you're Richard of Gloucester, you think, well, I'm the King's brother. It's obviously my role to have as protector or regent for the new king. If you're the Queen, you're thinking, well, yeah, he is the King's brother, but he's been up in the north. He doesn't know anything about what's going on down here at all. He's not been involved in the government of the country. And we've got an heir who's 12 years old. A couple of years, he'll be in his majority and will take over. Why change who's in control, if you like?
Yeah.
We can just carry on and I'll take the reins. Now, for Richard, Hastings' letter says, look, you better get down here quick, because Queen and her family are looking to take over things. Now, this kind of rivalry is totally normal in this sort of situation. So, you know, there's no adult king. So it's logical, it's quite natural that the leading players in the game are going to be jockeying for position. They're going to be arguing about who has the final say here and there. So that in itself is not unusual. Hastings' letter is not an invitation for Richard to come and take the throne. It's an invitation for Richard to just sort of protect his position and represent his brother, as it were, as protector.
And so provide a balance, almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, I guess we should see this in the context of this is, that they've had 50 years of civil war on and
Yeah,
off.
yeah,
So and I don't think we should necessarily, and this is not said with any expert eye, but just thinking that there may well have been some people, Hastings being the obvious candidate, whose prime concern wasn't necessarily furthering their own cause, but just maintaining stability and
yeah.
not wanting to see things deteriorate again.
As far as Hastings was concerned, and well, as far as everybody was concerned, including Richard, there was an heir to the throne. There was a new king, Edward V. The young prince would become Edward V, and that was sort of set in stone. I'm not sure that Richard. I mean, there will be some who say that Richard intended to take the throne immediately after the death of his brother. I don't think that's true at all. I think Richard came south expecting to take control of the prince himself so that he would be an active force in the government of the country.
Yeah.
That's what he intended. So he met up with the prince, or at least he met up with Earl Rivers, and on their way to London, they sort of agreed to meet. It wasn't an ambush,
Yeah.
and they had dinner. Buckingham, Richard, and Rivers had dinner together in Northampton. And as far as Rivers was concerned, he was shocked when the following morning he was arrested. He thought everything was going very well because here on one hand you've got the king's uncle on his mother's side, and on the other you've got the king's uncle on his father's side. So they're both uncles of the king who they assumed the king's best interests at heart.
Yeah, Rivers seems to have been quite an astute tutor to Prince Edward, and probably was a victim of circumstances here. But also, a point you made in your podcast show, in the Wars of the Roses podcast, was that Gloucester came south with a few hundred men, not with thousands. It's not like he came with an army to take military control over everything.
No, I think the other thing about Richard is it was a reaction. It wasn't, he didn't say, right, next thing to do is march south and take the throne. He was reacting to Hastings' letter. Hastings had actually worked very hard to restrict the number of men that Rivers was bringing to London with the young king.
Yeah.
Obviously, there needed to be an escort, but they'd limited it, and the limit was actually something like 2,000. So the king's force coming from Ludlow to London, intercepted by Richard with his few hundred men, was much larger. So there's no real evidence at that point to suggest that Richard had anything in mind other than joining the king but certainly trying to influence the young king. No doubt about that.
Yeah. So back to the movie, and we see Buckingham, who has already come across in the play as a slightly sneaky character. He asks Catesby to ask Hastings where he stands on the succession and to report to them the result. So what's Hastings' position? Where does he think the succession should be? Richard tells Catesby to give his greetings to Hastings to inform him that his enemies, Lords Rivers and Grey, are being held in Pomfret Castle. So Hastings is approached and predicts that the future is uncertain for many of them, but he seems quite cheerful as he sets out for London. A group of courtiers meet in council. Hastings asks when the coronation should be held. The Archbishop suggests the next day, and when another of the courtiers says, well, we should ask the Lord what the Lord Protector thinks, obviously meaning Richard. As they wander, Richard arrives and takes Buckingham aside to learn what he knows about Hastings' intent. He is told that Hastings would rather lose his head than support any claimant other than Prince Edward. Richard offers Buckingham the town of Hereford if he will support him to become king. Inside the council room, the remaining men speculate about where Richard and Buckingham have gone and what they're talking about, and even Hastings now appears nervous. Richard reappears to ask the council what they think about people who plot his death. Hastings says, well, such people should be punished. Richard then accuses the Queen and Jane Shore of committing witchcraft against him and accuses Hastings of treason and orders him executed. Without much preamble at all, Hastings accepts his fate with calm resignation, and we see the axe fall. So in a very short space of time, this key advisor to the royal house is taken off and has his head chopped off.
Yeah, it's a big shock. It's a big shock to Hastings, but it's a big shock to everybody else as well. And this is what's often forgotten, that the impact of Hastings, someone right at the centre of the court, being executed by Richard of all people, is a big shock, and that's one of the things. If people were talking already, and they might have been, a bit suspicious of Richard's actions. But if they weren't talking before that, they were certainly talking afterwards, because they were thinking, what the heck's going on? If Richard can execute Hastings, no one is safe at all.
Yeah.
So that was a real wake up for everybody else. And at the same time, as Hastings is executed, Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, is also arrested, though he's later released. Now, these men are heavyweights. These men they have resources, they have men-at-arms, they have lands. And there's probably only about 7 or 8 in the entire country who are that powerful.
Yeah.
One of them's Buckingham. Buckingham's an interesting character, very interesting. He meets up with, as we said, Rivers and Richard on the way to London, and he quickly seems to become very much a part of Richard's plans. But it's worth saying that Buckingham had excellent lineage. He was descended from Edward III as well. He had a claim to the throne himself. He had immense lands in the west and Wales. He was a very wealthy man. But Edward IV, who was a good judge of men and who used his magnates, his important men to the full, rarely used Buckingham for anything other than ceremonial matters. In other words, Edward, that good judge of men, didn't trust him. And if Edward didn't trust you, crikey. I think he was the worst possible combination. He was untrustworthy, or perceived to be untrustworthy, and he was also pretty useless. He didn't get things done very well. He was pretty hopeless. And on both counts, for Edward, he was someone you didn't use. But Richard needed a powerful ally, and he thought, well, okay, the triumvirate of me, Hastings and Buckingham will be enough to sort of control things. So you then come to, in that case, why on earth did he execute Hastings? And I think the play and the film have an element of truth in them. I think Catesby is directly involved in what happens to Hastings. I think he is used to sound Hastings out.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, this is all very surprising. It's surprising to people at the time, as I've said, but Hastings wouldn't have been looking for that. He would be thinking, well, yeah, I'll talk to Richard about it. He'd known Richard since Richard was a boy. He was older than Richard. So he would feel that he was like an uncle to Richard. He would feel that this was someone he could deal with, he could talk to, not someone who was going to take him out.
Sure. Catesby was he wasn't a noble himself, was he? Catesby,
No,
he was
He was a lawyer, and he had dealings with a number of courtiers, one of whom was Hastings. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly where Catesby becomes an agent of the king or Buckingham rather than a friend of Hastings or a supporter of Hastings. So at some point in there, something changes.
Yeah.
But we don't know when.
No, and it's also worth saying, we mentioned earlier that Richard had dispatched someone to go and fetch the younger of Edward IV's children, young Prince Richard, from Sanctuary. They did actually persuade Elizabeth Woodville to release him to attend his brother's coronation as the excuse, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah, that was a little later. Elizabeth Woodville had gone to Sanctuary, as the film and the play suggest. When she heard her brother Rivers had been arrested, she saw the writing on the wall and thought, right. It wasn't the first time she'd been to Westminster Abbey and Sanctuary, so this was a path she knew. And so she went there. She took her daughters. She took her younger son Richard, and the key for Richard of Gloucester was that the younger son was important. So as long as he tried to control the older son, that was fine. But if he couldn't control the older son, who held the younger son became then an issue. And
Right.
one of the things that Richard finds when he first meets Prince Edward, having arrested Rivers, is that basically the prince is no pushover. And the prince says, hang on a minute, what do you do that for? I want him released. And so Prince Edward is not the sort of malleable youth that Richard assumes he's going to be.
No. Well, if anyone's got, had a 12-year-old boy, they probably know they can be quite headstrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Or certainly from my experience having a 12-year-old girl. So, yeah.
She does give up the younger prince, but basically because, and here I think that the film is relatively accurate. If she doesn't give him up, he's going to be taken out by
Yeah.
in fact it's the Duke of Norfolk, it's not Buckingham, but yes, he'll be taken out of sanctuary forcibly if she doesn't give him up. And basically the Archbishop would rather troops didn't come into Westminster Abbey and wrench the prince from his mother's bosom, as it were. So he helps to persuade her, look, the boy's perfectly safe. You need to let him go to be with his brother. So that's how it happens.
Sure. So back to the movie. On a board a carriage, Duke of Buckingham is telling the Lord Mayor of London that Hastings was a traitor and he'd been beguiled by Jane Shore, the King's mistress, who'd become Hastings' mistress. Meeting Richard, Buckingham tells him he's spread the rumours about the prince's illegitimacy about, and yet further, there's a possibility that the late King Edward may also have been illegitimate, evidenced by his lack of resemblance to their late father. However, he says none of the citizens are responding either positively or negatively to the news. He uses local officials to spread the word, and then he goes outside to urge the Lord Mayor to also tell the folk of London of Richard's piety and goodness. Catesby is also in on the act, and he tells the gathered crowd that Richard is with two clergy, praying and seeking divine guidance. Richard then appears on a terrace to be beseeched by Buckingham that he has been at fault by refusing to take the crown in favour of a blighted stock, and in classic style, Richard tries to look as if he's refusing the crown, whilst making sure that his words lead to the crowd calling for his coronation. Just on the reality of that, Jane Shore appears a fair bit in the film, and she was a real person.
Oh yes, Jane Shore was a real person. She was the King Edward's mistress, and probably Hastings' mistress as well, and possibly a number of others. But she had not really any political role as such. But I mean, Richard does seem to have had it in for her in a way, because he did imprison her and made her walk through the streets in shame. And yeah, he said, I think probably I've always felt that Richard did disapprove of Edward's lifestyle. He was not the same as his brother in that respect, and he didn't welcome the mistresses and all the rest of it that Edward had at his court. So Jane Shore, I guess, might perhaps have been a little bit of a scapegoat, but also she was known to be associated with Hastings. So by imprisoning her, by punishing her, it was helping to build a case that this guy Hastings should have been executed because he was clearly up to no good. So it was building a conspiracy theory, if you like, to justify the sudden execution of Hastings.
Yeah.
But there's no real evidence that she had any impact on events as such.
Okay, so back in the movie, Anne Neville is being told that she must go to Westminster to be crowned Queen, something she clearly doesn't want to do. Lord Stanley, an elder noble with her, sends a young noble, the Marquis of Dorset, to meet with Richmond in France. This is Henry, Duke of Richmond. This is our first mention of the Earl of Richmond, soon to be known as Henry Tudor. We also see Richard being crowned king, although some of the nobles present can't bring themselves to acclaim him. As he takes the throne, Queen Anne collapses. It's all very dramatic and probably not worth spending too much time on. Richard then summons Buckingham and says, "Can I really be king whilst Princes Edward and Richard still live?" Buckingham hesitates, so Richard summons Catesby and asks him if he knows of anyone who will work for gold. Catesby replies he does know of such a man. Richard then tells him to put it about that his wife Anne is sick and may well die. Catesby retires as Richard tells us, the audience, that to secure his line, he must marry his brother's daughter. Richard then warns Lord Stanley he must go and summon his men, but he's to leave his son George as hostage against his loyalty. Richard is reminded by Buckingham about the promise he made to give him Hereford. Richard explodes at him, telling the Duke that he is not in the giving vein this night. Buckingham mutters to himself that maybe he should flee to the Earl of Richmond whilst he still has his head. So, I mean, that's talk about compressing time. So we've got Lord Stanley, who is father-in-law to Henry Tudor, and he's a former Lancastrian stalwart, But he does seem to have led a bit of a charmed life. Or, as you said earlier, he's a very, very powerful magnate, and I guess you don't take him on lightly.
No, you don't. And the evidence is there in the fact that Richard releases him when he initially arrested him because he can't afford to take out Stanley as well. It's a numbers game in the end. He could appoint somebody else, but Stanley's got a whole tribe of sons, and that's just going to lead to more chaos in the north. Stanley is a power in the northwest. He's a serious player in the game, so he needs Stanley on side. Stanley, as we know, is prepared to hedge his bets to make sure he ends up on the successful side. It's what he does,
Yeah.
and he's been often criticised more recently for it. But he's a survivor, and if you ask the average person whether he'd do the same, I think they probably would, because it's easy after the event to say, oh, he wasn't honourable or this, that, and the other. But as you said earlier about someone, he survived and he got to do stuff, whereas taking a very extreme line, you sometimes don't survive. I think it's interesting in the film and in the play that Stanley is given the action that he contacts Richmond, that he sends the Marquis of Dorset, who is Elizabeth Woodville's son by her first marriage, so that he sends him to Henry Tudor, whereas the reality is most likely that it's Margaret Beaufort, who is Stanley's wife, who actually is the brains behind the whole thing.
And she, from her first marriage, she's the mother to Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond.
She is. She's
Yeah.
Henry Tudor's mother, and again, a lot of rubbish is talked about her, but she's a very capable and determined woman. But up until this point, there's no suggestion that she ever thought that her son would be king. He does have a distant claim to the throne, but when we come to the summer of 1483, even when Richard takes control, there's not a suggestion that she wants Henry to rival Richard. The key is the princes. And,
Yeah.
she doesn't send anybody to Henry Tudor to start talking about coming to England or plotting against Richard until she's pretty certain that both the princes are dead.
Yeah.
Because, and Elizabeth Woodville the same. These two women are at the heart of a conspiracy, but it's a conspiracy that, unlike what Richard would have us believe, it's a conspiracy that starts after the princes are dead or believed to be dead.
And if people haven't, just in case anyone hasn't connected the story of the Princes in the Tower, these are the two young men we're talking about, Princes Edward and Richard, the children of Edward IV. It's what people believed is what they will take action on, not necessarily what actually happened.
Absolutely.
Buckingham, immediately we've seen, as soon as he's denied his blood price, if you like, or his loyalty price, he starts talking about turning on Richard. And it kind of reinforces this thing of, yeah, you can kind of get why Edward IV didn't trust him. He seems a particularly slippery character.
Yes, I think the film is slightly inaccurate, but we can forgive it that, I think. Yes, Buckingham was promised part of another large noble inheritance by Richard, and it's something that he'd been nagging Edward IV for years. And Edward hadn't seen fit to give him any more power than he already had, for obvious reasons, from what we've said of Edward's opinion of Buckingham. So Buckingham expects that by helping Richard, he will receive rather more than he already has at the moment. And he's got a lot.
Yeah.
So we don't know. The bottom line is we do not know why Buckingham turned against Richard. The options are he was appalled that the princes had been killed. Possible. He was persuaded by a prisoner he held, Bishop John Morton, who was in contact with Margaret Beaufort. So it's possible that Morton, sort of turned him away from the dark side, as it is. It's also possible that he just thought, yeah, maybe there's a chance for me to create enough chaos to put my own claim to the throne forward. because his claim was no worse than Henry Tudor's, that's for sure. And
No.
it's also possible that he just thought he was on the wrong side and maybe needed to change sides. But it does demonstrate the unreliability of the man politically. And of course, what happens afterwards in the rebellion that occurs shows his ineffectiveness as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Back in the movie or the play, King Richard, now as he is, meets Tyrrell, the man that Catesby had spoken of who would work for gold. And Richard tells him quite openly that he is to kill the bastards in the tower. Tyrrell is shocked but agrees, and in the next scene we see him smothering the boys with a cushion. Lord Stanley tells Buckingham, who is departing to France, to tell Earl Richmond he cannot openly revolt whilst the king holds his son, but if he comes to give battle, Stanley and his men will fight for Henry against King Richard. Buckingham agrees and rides off. Richard, again addressing the audience, tells us that the princes and his wife Anne have both died. Catesby rushes in and informs Richard that Buckingham has joined Richmond, who is sailing to invade England. Lord Stanley arrives and agrees that Henry of Richmond is arriving to make a claim to the throne. Then we see messenger after messenger arriving, bringing a succession of bulletins about Henry's progress, and they're then told that Buckingham has been caught, and Richard responds with, "Off with his head," and then orders his army to prepare to march. Well, we've mentioned the princes in the tower already, and as we said, unless someone finds some bodies, and I know some bones were found, but without DNA testing, I think aren't there said to be two buried in Westminster Abbey, but the Archbishop of Canterbury has forbidden anyone to dig them up again because they were looked at.
Yeah, they were looked at. They were found in the 17th century, and they basically nobody really knows if they're even the right age. They are young, but it's very difficult to tell without a DNA test, obviously. And even then, you're not entirely sure that they're not some other person, some other bastard born to a member of the royal family, because the DNA would be the same. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think personally, I think it's been argued quite often. Well, is it really fair to dig up dead people just to satisfy our curiosity in the 21st century? Is there, morally, is it right to do it just because we want to know? Is it right to dig them up, these dead people? So I think if you excavate something and you discover, as they did, Richard's body, then that's fair enough, because you're excavating an area and yes, you were looking for him and you found him. So you now need to identify whether you actually found who you were looking for. But the idea of just digging people up to see who they're descended from seems to me to not have the same moral argument. But if
No,
we
that's
look
a
at
fair point. Yeah.
I mean, it is still being argued over a lot, but I think at the end of the day, it sort of misses the point. The whole thing about the princes in the tower misses the point, because Richard said that, you mentioned earlier, Richard claimed that they were illegitimate, and he also, in fact, first of all, claimed that his older brother was illegitimate, which was a bit rich considering his mother was still alive and living in London, and
Yeah.
might have been a bit miffed that he was accusing her of adultery. But however, moving on from that, it's clearly, again, it shows Richard's lack of preparation, because it clearly doesn't work. So he thinks, well, we better try something else. So he says the princes are illegitimate, which again is, I think it's unlikely, but let's argue that it was true, that they were illegitimate. Plenty of times in English history where Parliament just passes an act to say they are legitimate.
Yeah.
So there's absolutely no reason why Edward V could not have been king. The fact that he was declared illegitimate was a matter for a church court, it was a matter for canon law, and even if the church court said, yes, we find him illegitimate, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. He could still have been king. So the whole illegitimacy thing is a red herring. And the death of the princes and who killed them is also a red herring, because, as you said not long ago, what matters is what people believed had happened at the time.
And whether they were killed or they were shipped away and grew old in a lovely life in a monastery somewhere, it removed them from the power struggle. And so in a way, as you say, it doesn't really matter.
No.
But the belief at the time from what I've read, seems to be that people just assumed, yeah, well, Richard of Gloucester's had them killed. And I mean, I've mentioned in the notes here, I mean, when Augustus, or Octavianus as he was then, came to power after beating Antony and Cleopatra, he made darn sure that Cleopatra and Julius Caesar's son Caesarea was found and killed. And he said, you know, I think supposedly he said something along the lines of, this world's too small for two Caesars. And yet no one sort of thinks of him as this villainous monster the way they do about Richard III.
No, that's right. And the thing is that I've heard people say today that, well, the princes were no threat to him because they were illegitimate. Well, that's nonsense. They were Edward's sons. Nobody questioned that they were Edward's sons, so they had a claim to the throne. You know, it was they were always going to be a threat.
Yeah, and the timing with Anne Neville dying as well, we don't think was very close to this, or it should have happened later than this, is it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the coronation of Anne and Richard was early July 1483. There's no evidence that she was ill at the time, or indeed reluctant to be queen, but one way or another, she seemed healthy enough. Only when we get to 1484, in the early months of 1484, she seems to be gradually becoming more unwell, and she dies in the early months of 1484. So quite a while after the coronation, and quite a while before the events of Bosworth and so on. And what the last bit you were talking about from the film, basically, it puts a whole load of things together. There is a landing by Henry Tudor in October 1483, or an attempted landing. And Buckingham's rebellion is that event. By 1485, 18 months later, Buckingham's long dead. He's executed in 1483. So he's gone. So he's nothing to do with the preamble to Bosworth at all.
Right. So in a way, they sort of get that right, that, you know, he says to Richard, give me what you promised me. And Richard says, get lost. And he says, right, I'm now in rebellion against you. Oh, no, I've just lost and now I'm dead. So, it does seem that he, like you said earlier, not only was he untrustworthy, he was also reasonably incompetent, which are two very good reasons for Edward IV not to have trusted him. Richard's probably better off without him.
Yeah, absolutely. The irony of the thing is that the rebellion in October 1483 is always called Buckingham's Rebellion because he is the leading man involved in it. But he's really on the coattails of it. He's not leading, he's following. It's Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville, and in fact the key supporters, and if you look at exactly who supported that revolt and who later will support Henry Tudor, they are Edward's men. They are Edward's household knights, his key officials around the south of England, who fervently believed that Edward V, that the princes had been killed, and that Richard had seized the throne and shouldn't have it, basically. So you have a groundswell of opposition to Richard III as early as October 1483. And that continues to Bosworth.
And of course, these guys now have no choice but to side with the side of this ongoing dispute or this ongoing struggle that had been their enemies. So you've got the House of York, who had welded themselves to Edward IV and therefore to his son Edward V, now having to turn against the current representative of the House of York, as in Richard of Gloucester, by siding with the Lancastrians, with Henry Tudor. So in a way, Henry Tudor is uniting the two roses, you'd think.
Yeah, he is, but only inadvertent. Well, not quite inadvertently. I mean, Henry is an astute person, and he realises that in order to be successful against Richard, he must have Yorkist support. It's impossible for him to succeed without it. And as you rightly say, the Yorkist supporters, those who are loyal to Edward, very similar, if you like, to William Hastings, they're outraged and they want to do something about it. But the only thing they can do, the only player around, is Henry Tudor. There's nobody else that they can turn to.
So the movie then takes us directly to Bosworth, the Battle of Bosworth Fields. Richard is told that Henry is coming, but he only has a third of his own numbers, only 6,000 or 7,000 against his 20-odd thousand. We see Lord Stanley with his men, and a messenger arrives to tell him that the king orders him to join the royal army if he values his son's life. Stanley appears hesitant and undecided. He then rides off with his banner to meet with Henry Tudor. This is the first time we actually see him. He addresses Stanley as stepfather. Stanley then tells Henry that he will hang back and then commit his men to support Henry once he's secured his son's safety. And you think, right, I'll wait till you're winning. And it almost reminds me of Yes, Prime Minister, when Jim Hacker, the Prime Minister, says to Bernard, he said, in a real battle, which side is the civil service on? And he says, oh, that's simple, Prime Minister, the winning side. And you think, Stanley's doing a very good job of being a Sir Humphrey. So
he is, yeah.
So back in the movie, we got Richard speaks to Catesby in his tent as night falls, calls for a bowl of wine. Then we go into a classic bit of Shakespeare. We saw it with Henry V, and he's agonising over decisions he's made. We see Henry of Richmond. He's wearing the Welsh dragon as an emblem. He's praying for victory. Meanwhile, Richard is haunted by the ghosts of King Edward, his brother Clarence, the young princes, his dead Queen Anne. Woken by Catesby and Ratcliffe, Richard tells him of his bad dream. But he recovers his confidence, arms, and tells his men of his plan. His army line up as he sends messengers to Lord Stanley again, telling him to attack Henry's flank once Richard has engaged the rebel army. The two sides advance on each other and the battle begins. Stanley just holds firm, and Richard stares towards him, as does Henry. A fight starts amongst some of the men, but then the two sides, which seem to be Stanley's and Henry's, stop fighting, embrace, and Stanley's men leave the field, returning to their lord. Richard orders George Stanley executed, but his man replies that they'll have to do it after the battle. The king puts on his helmet and charges towards Henry, and the two rivals clash swords. Seeing Stanley approaching, Richard's horse is hamstrung by a soldier. He manages to mount another horse, but it's shot down by an archer, and he's now on foot. And the famous cry, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, comes from an anguished Richard. Lord Stanley approaches, and they fight before Stanley's men surround Richard and stab him to death. His body is thrown over a horse, and as the horse is led away, we see the garter on his leg bearing the legend, Honi suis qui mal y pense, said to mean, although there is some dispute, evil be to he who evil thinks. Lord Stanley finds the crown lying on the ground and carries it towards Henry, and that's the end. So that's an awful lot in a very short space of time. So first of all, the numbers. How close are they? We've seen it exaggerated at Agincourt, and these. We're starting to get towards a time when there's proper documentation, but Henry was outnumbered.
Oh, seriously outnumbered. I think the film's pretty spot on there, actually. I think Henry's force would probably have been around 6,000, 7,000 perhaps, because basically Henry was very much the underdog. He'd landed in Wales, he'd hoped to pick up a lot of support there, and he did pick up some support. And men did go to his cause, particularly because he brought with him about 500 men who were, in fact, Yorkists, if you like. They would have supported Edward IV, probably fought for Edward IV, some of them, or their fathers did. So he had a core of an army, but that's all, really. He had very little in the way of cannon. There's no evidence he had very many cannon, whereas Richard had an army at least twice the size, possibly 3 times the size of Richard's, and also had a great deal of ordnance and a large number of cannons. So, in terms of the two sides, on paper, and that's the key thing, on paper, Richard had no chance of losing. He had to win. He had overwhelmingly large odds against Henry. The problem was, how steadfast would Richard's army be? And it's not just Lord Stanley. There's a whole load of people at various levels of society. If you take, I mentioned a few minutes ago, the men of Edward IV, the men who were loyal to Edward IV, of those who'd stayed in England in the mid-1480s and sort of toughed it out and sort of bit their tongues when they had to sort of do Richard's bidding and so on, of those, how many of them would actually fight for Richard in the end? And there's many examples of people who either didn't turn up, who were supposed to turn up and didn't turn up, or some who did turn up and just didn't fight. And there's a lot of evidence of that. So while Stanley is the villain, he's the one who's always named, not just him, but the Earl of Northumberland as well, incidentally, who had a very large contingent of men and was in Richard's rear guard. And basically, he lagged behind and took really no part in the battle at all. And that was a huge part of Richard's army.
Yeah,
Um,
you go on ahead. I'll catch you up. I'm just tying my
yeah,
shoelaces.
yeah.
Yeah,
But when you consider that Northumberland was bringing, if you like, a northern army, and Richard had so many connections with the north, you'd have thought that was almost the backbone of his army. But it didn't turn out that way.
no,
And and Stanley is the one that is credited, if that's the right word, with betraying him. But you mentioned that the film refers to George Stanley, the son of Lord Stanley, being a hostage. And I think it's pretty accurate that Richard does give the order for him to be executed, but they don't carry it out. And I think they don't carry it out because a number of his courtiers are already planning for what happens next. And what happens
yeah.
next might well be that Richard isn't in charge anymore. So let's not execute Stanley's son. Let's not rush into anything. And in fact, would you believe it? George Stanley then escapes soon afterwards by
By
accident.
by accident, yeah.
From
Is this
yeah,
George Stanley? Is this Lord Strange?
it is Lord Strange. Yeah,
I just love that name. It just sounds like someone out of a Austin Powers movie.
it does. Yeah.
Now, one person who is not mentioned, as far as I can tell, at all in Shakespeare's play, but actually, as you made very clear in your show, deserves an awful lot of credit for Henry's success, is the Earl of Oxford.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
this is a series. This is like William Marshall, the Knight of England reborn. He's sounds an incredible character who doesn't seem to have got too involved. He seems that sounds like damning with faint praise. He's a proper bluff old soldier, and he's just loyal, but very, very good at what he does.
Yeah. I mean, Oxford. John de Vere is his name, Earl of Oxford. He is a dyed-in-the-wool Lancastrian, right through and through. He's prepared to go to jail and rot there, but he's not going to stop being a supporter of the House of Lancaster. And basically, he gets out of prison where he is in Calais, and he joins Henry Tudor in France. And this gives Henry Tudor someone with real military experience. I mean, Oxford is one of the foremost generals of his day. So to have him on your side is a big plus. And he leads Henry's vanguard in the battle. A role, incidentally, that morning Henry had offered to Lord Stanley, but
Yeah.
Stanley had politely declined and said, "Well, we'll be there or thereabouts." I think the thing about Stanley, which I would stress, is that Stanley must have intended to support Henry, all things being equal, because otherwise, why take the enormous risks he did? Why give Richard any cause for concern if he was doubtful about whether he'd support Henry? I think
Yeah.
as long as it worked out okay, he would support Henry. So it was a matter of timing.
So
But
I suppose it would only have been if Henry's army had immediately broken and run, he'd have thought, well, I'm not going to try and support you now because you're definitely going to lose.
absolutely.
And also, I mean, the first engagement, Oxford attacking the King's vanguard, which was led by the Duke of Norfolk, and leads to the death of Norfolk. I, I don't know how accurately it would be, but the soldiers under Norfolk, under the feudal system, would when their leader is killed, would they have almost thought, well, that's us off the hook because we can run now because our boss is dead. So our little bit of battle has been lost. Because it does seem that they didn't stay as long as King Richard might have liked them to.
Well, that whole incident, that whole little battle within the battle is really interesting because you've actually got Oxford, whose lands used to be in East Anglia, up against the Duke of Norfolk, who now has a lot of Oxford's old lands because his power is obviously in East Anglia. So you've got two guys up against each other who, oddly enough, 12 years earlier had been on opposite sides at the Battle of Barnet. So these two, they knew all about each other, and they were both pretty good warriors. They were both experienced men. So the fighting was actually, it was the hardest bit of fighting in the battle. between the two vanguards. But I think the defeat of Norfolk, pushing Norfolk back, was the key part, in a way, of the battle, because that prompted Richard to say, right, okay, I've got to do something. If Stanley's not going to come in and support me, I have to actually do something. And he did.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, one thing that does come out, and even Shakespeare gives him some credit for this, is Richard's no coward. And it's worth pointing out that until the death of his brother, he'd been fiercely loyal to Edward, and he'd been an effective commander, it seems. But now he commits with his household knights, and it still doesn't go well.
It's close, you know.
Exactly. I mean, and obviously you could get one crossbow bolt or one arquebus bullet or whatever you call in the firearms then, or a longbow arrow, as happened with Harold at 1066. You know, can kill the king.
Well,
does it feel to you that is the turning point, that when Richard falls?
I think you'd have to say that Richard's attempt to get at Henry himself is the critical moment, because he's still got a few things in his favour, and let's not forget that if Henry falls, Lord Stanley's going to be the most loyal person Richard's ever known, because it's all about Henry Tudor's life, and Henry Tudor does not have a lot of men around him. Most of them were fighting already in the vanguard. He has such a small army, so Richard looks at it very sensibly, really. It's not a rash move, I don't think. It's just he thinks, well, action has to be taken. And he is someone who likes to take action. He likes to get on with it. And I think he just says, right, okay, let's take the bull by the horns. Let's go and get this man. And he comes incredibly close. And the only reason he doesn't succeed is not actually Thomas Stanley, but Thomas Stanley's brother William. It's William Stanley, not, I imagine, without the support of his brother or the knowledge of his brother, but it's William Stanley who dashes in with his men to help Henry Tudor out. And when you look at it, and we're not talking about precision timing here, this is a medieval battle. There's absolutely no way that William Stanley could have known he was going to get there in time. It was just sheer hope, because Henry was nearly killed. Came very close to being killed moments before William Stanley bothered to intervene. So there's a lot of luck involved. And you could say that Richard was actually very unlucky.
Yeah, and I mean, he becomes the last English king to die in battle, and there's not that many it's ever happened to. Richard the Lionheart, got hit by a crossbow bolt during a siege and died when the wound turned gangrenous. And Henry V, as we discussed earlier, died of maybe dysentery or possibly heat stroke whilst on campaign. But it's not quite the same thing as dying in the heat of battle. They didn't die in combat, just as a result of it. So, and it's just a pointless note here, but just for anyone from Scotland listening, the last British monarch to die in battle was James IV of Scotland, who died along with some 10,000 of his men at the Battle of Flodden nearly 30 years later. But Richard does die. Now, Battle of Bosworth Fields has been given huge significance in England's history, particularly. But when you put it like that, you realise, well, wow, it was so pivotal, because without Henry VII, there's no Henry VIII, there's no Greensleeves, apparently. There's no Elizabeth I, and the whole history of our country would have changed. But if Richard had won, bearing in mind his son, he had a son, but his son had died by this stage. What's your feeling? Do you think we'd have just continued, the Wars of the Roses would have continued longer?
Well, it's difficult to second guess, isn't it? But the problem, as you say quite rightly, Richard's own son was dead. That he had named one of his nephews, John de la Pole, as his heir. So in theory, when Richard was killed at Bosworth, in theory at least, John de la Pole was his named heir, and should therefore have been John II or whatever. But he didn't take up that option at the time, and
I blame him, really.
But if Richard won, he would have to look elsewhere. He would have to marry again, and he wasn't an old man, so that was a possibility. But he would have to marry again, and then you've got the hope that an adult son lives long enough, and Richard lives long enough for the dynasty to survive. And, but all these things hinge on those sort of gambles, really. With hindsight, again, it all appears Henry VII, Henry VIII, no problem. But of course, Henry VIII was quite young when his older brother Prince Arthur died, and all Henry VII was worried about for the entire reign was having a male heir old enough to rule when he died.
Yeah,
So it didn't end in a sense. Richard would have had the same worries as Henry Tudor had.
yeah.
Can I survive long enough? Have I got an heir who will,
And
carry
of course,
on my
Henry
legacy?
VIII had exactly the same concerns, hence the 6 wives.
Yeah,
Although
yeah,
that might not have been the reason for all of them, but
no.
certainly. And he failed to bring a son to adulthood, and hence we have Queen Mary and then, good Queen Elizabeth, good Queen Bess.
What I think that illustrates very well is the fact that when Elizabeth came to the throne, nobody thought this was going to be a good idea. Nobody thought she was going to survive very long. Everybody was really just sorting out who she was going to marry, and that person would obviously be in charge. But it just shows you that history is unpredictable. Who knew that she would be a success, that she would be so independent, so domineering? Who
Yeah,
knew? Whereas, again, it may be if Richard had died and left John de la Pole as his heir and he'd become John II, he might have been the best king we've ever had. You can't second guess it. It is what it is, and it's easy to say the Wars of the Roses would have continued, but who knows? It's impossible to say.
well, that segues very nicely into another question I had for you. That it is such a patriarchal society. The role of the women, the wives and the mothers, you can read between lines and see it's so key at times, and yet they don't have official roles and titles. We'd had the Empress Matilda earlier with Stephen, but is it underplayed? I mean, should we really be looking at these women and saying these are some very, very impressive leaders, especially people like Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville, who took great risks at times and seem to have been just as strong and as powerful and as effective as many of the men.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the women of the Wars of the Roses were huge characters, and it's not just those two. I mean, Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife, was a huge player in the game. I mean, she was ferocious in defending her son and her husband, and without her, we probably wouldn't be talking about the Wars of the Roses as any sort of long-term struggle, because she was very, very much involved in pursuing the struggle, in keeping it alive, as it were. So she was there, and you've also got Cecily Neville, the mother of Richard and Clarence and Edward IV, who was a formidable woman in her own right. So you've
Yeah,
got a lot of women who at times were actually quite powerful as well, but they were also extremely influential. I don't think men and women have changed that much really in their interaction with each other. You've only to think in your own family, in your own world of women who have strong personalities. Now, in the 15th century, they didn't necessarily have they couldn't own land, they didn't necessarily have wealth of their own, but they still could exert those personalities. And if you think of women you'd rather not argue too much against, those women existed in the 15th century as they exist now. So from a personality and an influence point of view, these women were strong and they had an effect.
yeah, and that's a very good point. And again, with another cunning segue, I've watched I'm afraid I can't remember the lady's name, but I watched a couple of the documentaries about the excavation of King Richard's body from
Yes,
a car park in Leicestershire. And the lady who started it is a member of the Ricardian Society, I think they're called.
yes,
And this is
probably,
a
yeah.
worldwide group of people who are obsessed with clearing his name to the point that they denied that he was a hunchback and they denied that he was evil. They denied he could, so they want him absolutely driven as a saint. But she started writing to the University of Leicester, and one of the archaeologists, he said, I thought, okay, yeah, we've got another nut job's letters here, and then started to realise there was actually quite a lot of effective research. So they started to go in with it, and They say one of the first rules of archaeology is you don't go looking for famous people because you never find them. And they did really quickly. And she was spot on with her lead, and she became very involved in it. She's a lovely lady, mildly eccentrically obsessed, as in that wonderful way that some people are. And you know, and thank goodness for her, because a lot of things were put right. One of which she was horrified to learn, is he had quite severe scoliosis of the spine. So he had curvature of the spine, but they said if he was fit and agile, which as a warrior he would have been, he could have covered it.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. And also, he was a young man during most of what took place. So as he got older, it might well have been more debilitating. But he obviously coped with it.
Yeah. And again, we'll put a link to the YouTube documentary. There's one that's very long, but it's unnecessarily long in my opinion. So I'll put the link to the better one, the more concise one. It's about 45 minutes. But it really is fascinating, the process they go through. And if he'd won at Bosworth, the current King of England might have been a man who's currently a Canadian cabinet maker, albeit living and working in London. He came from Canada, but he's the guy they got the DNA check from. And They said they both had a very, very rare and specific code in their DNA, which enabled the DNA scientists to say, you know, it's definitely Richard III. So extraordinary, yeah. I suppose the last question to ask is, you know, Shakespeare makes him out to be a villain, the Ricardian Society make him out to be a saviour, or was he just reacting to circumstances? And I'm going to guess what your answer will be.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I haven't, without bringing too much new in at this point, one of the things I haven't mentioned is that Richard's own position as a major landholder was also a little under threat at the death of the King Edward, because he held some of his lands during Edward's lifetime. So it wasn't just about the throne from his point of view, it was also about retaining his own very, very powerful position in the north. So I think he was defensive rather than offensive in what he did for most of the time in 1483. He wanted to safeguard his position, not take the throne. However, I think the catalyst is the young prince, who he decided he just could not work with. He could not control him.
Yeah.
And that's the moment at which Richard had to start thinking, okay, if I can't work with him, what are the alternatives?
And that's, I think, is the point you made in the podcast of, you know, this kid's 12. In 3 or 4 years' time, he will be deemed to have reached his majority. At which point, if you haven't completely got him on side, then you're probably going to suffer when he says, you remember my tutor that I was dearly beloved and the most important man in my life after my father when you had him executed? I think that you used some phrase like that, and it was a very gentle humour to it, but it was kind of like, yeah, sorry kid, you know, I can't let you get to that stage. And at that point, if he's removed the heir to the throne, he then becomes the heir to the throne. So it's almost like, I think I agree that from what we know, it doesn't seem likely that he was plotting from early adulthood that I'm going to get rid of everyone and I'll be king.
If he wasn't very good at it.
No.
But yeah, I mean, the other thing to mention about the 12-year-old prince or king is that at that time, 12 isn't a boy. 12 is old enough to bear arms. And, you know, a king of 12, his views need to be taken account of in council and in other matters. So he couldn't be ignored. It wasn't that he was 5 or 6 years old. No. He had to be noticed, you know.
I read an account of the Battle of Crecy where Edward III was commanding, but Edward the Black Prince, as we know him, commanded one wing of his dad's army, and all the grizzled old commanders who were there as his advisors said one thing, he did something else, and it worked. He was 16.
Yeah, that's right.
He was 16.
Yeah.
When I was 16, I was wondering if I dared turn the drop-down handlebars of my racer bike up, so I looked as cool as the kid up the street. I mean,
yeah,
you know,
different age.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It boggles the mind how quickly people had to grow up at that stage.
But they'd been trained for it since they were boys, you know?
Yeah,
It didn't
yeah.
just suddenly land on them. They'd been trained to fight. So they did it,
No,
you know?
and in that respect, I suppose, in a way, we had a harder time because no one gave me training for my paper round. I had to go out there and work it out for myself. So maybe
Yeah.
I should give myself more credit. Very conscious that we're on an hour and 40 plus minutes of this. And what I'd like to do now, Derek, is please just tell us about your historical novels, which I'm devoured books 1 and 2. I'm into 3. As I said to the folks earlier, they've been sat on my Kindle for quite a while, but all the reading I seem to have time to do was research for the show, and then over the festive season I've managed to prize some free time, and I can't put them down now. So this is the era that your books are about, but just give us a plug, let people know where they can find you.
Okay, well, yeah, my books are, as Martin said, about the Wars of the Roses. There are 2 series. The first series of 4 books is called Rebels and Brothers. And Rebels and Brothers really sort of almost follows the Edward IV timeline. And the hero, Ned Elder, one of a numerous number of elders in the books, he is about the same age as Edward IV. So he becomes involved in the struggle known as the Wars of the Roses, and we follow him and his sisters and the rest of the family and numerous characters through the trials and tribulations of the Wars of the Roses up to about 1471. So the first half, if you like, of that whole struggle. And then the second series is called The Craft of Kings, and that picks up the elder family again in 1481, 1482, and that traces through. There are 3 books so far, which traces us through as far as 1483. I've got 1 book left to write uh, called The Crown of Fear, which is going to tell us about Richard III and Bosworth. So that one's yet to come. So all the books are available on Amazon and can be ordered in bookshops as well. So if you look up my website, www.derekbirks.com, then that will tell you all you need to know. So that's what I've been doing for the past 7 or 8 years. But I've also now, some listeners may be interested to know, I just brought a book out in a completely different time period, which is the post-Roman period. And so that's out at the moment, and there'll be a sequel to that as well. So yeah, that's my story in novels.
I should point out, your surname is Birks. It's not
Yes.
Burkes, as some people might think.
Yeah, correct. Yes.
But yeah, and of course your podcast is the Wars of the Roses podcasts, and is available on iTunes and all other good wherever you get your iTunes or your
Yeah.
podcasts from.
Yeah.
You'll find it there. As I said earlier, the great thing is people can now download the whole lot and listen to it in these wonderful little sort of 15 to 20 minute chunks,
Yeah.
which was very frustrating when you're listening to it as it's released. So, but we've started doing that to people recently, breaking our shows down into sort of 30 to 40 minute chunks. This is a festive season special. You're going to get 2 massive episodes to keep you happy before Andrew and I come back with Frost Nixon. So total change of pace.
Oh yes.
But the books are fantastic. If people have read the Bernard Cornwell, Con Eagledon, these really good stories where there's a historical framework around which a fictional character is woven with so many clever twists and plots. I like to think of myself as a good storyteller, but someone else has got to write the story, and I'm so envious of your talent, Derek, because I'm not going to give anything away, but there are so many little bits you go, wow, that's really clever, and it works really nicely. And your characters are rounded. I mean, Eleanor, amazing woman though she is, and incredibly capable, there's times you just want to bang her head against the wall, especially if you
Absolutely.
Rag Wolf. I said I wouldn't give anything away, so I'm not. But I thoroughly recommend it. They're available on Kindle. I've got them on my Kindle, or your other e-readers are available as well. Wonderful. So Derek, thank you so much for joining us. I should just add at this point, when I say goodbye, I'm saying goodbye to the listeners. But if you can just hang on for a minute, we'll just do some admin bits, and I probably won't even edit that out because people like to hear that the fact that it doesn't happen by magic. But thank you so much for joining us, and all the very, very best for 2020 and beyond.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. It's been an absolute pleasure to be involved this morning, and yes, I look forward to hearing the final product again.
Yep, well, we will be out on Sunday the 19th of January. This half of the show will go out with its precursor having gone a week before. So
lovely.
We're going to binge the listeners. All right, brilliant. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.